In mid-2021, the European Union set a path to strengthen its strategic engagement in the Indo-Pacific region in line with the principles of democracy, rule of law, respect for human rights, and international law. Priority areas for cooperation in the region include, among others, strengthening rules to protect international trade against unfair practices, including industrial subsidies, economic coercion, forced technology transfers, and IP theft, and promoting an open and rules-based regional security architecture. The region produces over 60% of global GDP. It is the second largest destination of EU exports and home to 4 of EU's 10 biggest trading partners, China the largest of them. We're witnessing a rapid military buildup in the region and tensions around contested territories and maritime zones in the East and South China Seas and the Taiwan Strait. This is accompanied by a raft of unfair trade practices and economic coercion that has undermined efforts to establish a level commercial playing field based on transparency and the rule of law. The space domain has now taken center stage in this competition among the major space powers. This video provides expert views on the key ingredients of forging partnerships in the Indo-Pacific region while strengthening and promoting norms and standards that can create a sustainable space economy regionally and globally.
Traditional space alliances, I think, are going to continue, but the modalities for the interactions are going to become more diverse and more complex. As we go beyond the ISS, we're going to be looking at more commercial partnerships beyond the traditional kind of central government, no exchange of fund, barter arrangement. And we have to figure out how we're going to incorporate private sector providers, because it's somewhat difficult to imagine, say, European or American taxpayers paying for services from, another country. I mean, barter arrangements have been politically acceptable, but supporting a foreign country's space capabilities with tax money is a little bit more difficult. It can be done, but as we witnessed in buying Russian, Soyuz seats, but how do we handle, commercial partnerships and commercial providers within the traditional relationship, I think is the first issue.
There will be more intensive cooperation with traditional space alliance or traditional space cooperation partners. The space is becoming so important in the political, economic, and military power. That means that the space becomes more important target when there is a conflict. And in order to be resilient, I think you need to have a more established relationship with the traditional space alliance and traditional space partners.
I think space has become an extension of the terrestrial politics that we see today. And I think there is a sort of a new coalition sort of thing emerging, new space alliances, new coalitions that are happening, whether it is in terms of the Quad countries, which comprises of the US, Australia, Japan, and India, collaborating on SSA. So the traditional space alliances might be there, and that might still be very functional. But I think there are also driven by the balance of power politics, given by the shifting geopolitical balance of power. There are new coalitions that are happening. There are also other minilaterals that are coming up. So whether it is in terms of India-Japan bilateral or India-Japan-US trilateral, these are also beginning to look at space as an important part of their agenda in a sense. And the kind of threat perceptions that these 3 or 4 countries, some of the major powers are sharing, it all has to do with the growing Chinese military power, but also the Russian repeated anti-satellite tests over the last couple of years. That's also an issue of major concern.
I think partnerships, commercial or international, are vital. And the reason is twofold. One is they, of course, allow you to sort of share costs, and everybody, kind of likes that, even though it comes with greater complexity. But also the benefits has been the relationships that have come out of it.
to have more resilience, it is extremely important, not just depending on the one country, but having many countries as your friends and allies. For example, if you want to do the SSA, if you want to do the more holistic picture, then you have to have the SSA from many points in the world.
It is absolutely important that the established space players also partner with new spacefaring nations. But I think it is important that established space players work with, partner with, engage in technology transfer, for instance, engage in training. So I see the partnership between established space players and emerging space players in two ways. One is in terms of stepping up their own capabilities so that they can benefit from access to space. Second is in terms of the collaborative effort that can bring benefits in the area of space global governance, which is also enormous because we have been at a standstill when it comes to making progress on the global governance front with regard to space.
A public-private partnership is one where somebody else is paying part of your fixed costs. If you're simply selling things in a commercial-like manner, that can simply be clever contracting. True partnership means that you're sharing some of the fixed costs. And so the question is, where are there areas where the private sector is willing to bear some fixed costs? I think in areas that create revenues like communication satellites and remote sensing, like power on the moon or space facilities or things like that. So the countries in the Indo-Pacific region, the question for them is, to what extent do they have a maturing private sector that will be able to and willing to take on support of fixed costs with the government? The problem is the only ones that I really see there are probably, China and Japan, maybe Korea. In the case of China, it's obviously the biggest one, but to what extent you really have a private sector there? There are companies that look and act like private sector entities, but at the end of the day, they're going to have either the permission of or the support of the government.
The private-public partnership is changing dynamically. Today, it is the private industry which are leading the new cutting-edge technologies or new services such as on-orbital services or the large-scale constellations. These are the new activities driven by the private initiatives. Public entity becomes as a sort of a funder, they're providing funding and also a customer, and also playing as a regulator. It makes it much easier for the new spacefaring nations to come in, because it's no longer the state-to-state rivalry. It is a market competition. So and it's easier for them to transit from public activities to public-private partnership activities. I think that Japan has a potential to lead to create such trend in the Indo-Pacific, and I think that will create an attractiveness.
I think the role of public-private partnership is going to become a lot more important, consequential for a few reasons. There is a huge talent that is available outside the government mechanism. Because when you look at the Indo-Pacific countries, most of the countries, by and large, have state-run space programs, whether it is India or China. So you have talent, you have cost effectiveness, you have timeliness and delivery in a timely fashion. And fourth is the possible bringing enough investment from the private sector that can also be a very attractive thing for the governments that are already struggling with the size of the economy going down, the economy being badly hit by the pandemic.
So the issue of dependency inducing is, though not primarily a problem with Russia, because Russia increasingly doesn't have anything to offer. Now, in the case of China, there's certainly the package deal, there's the debt traps and other things that I think we're all familiar with. One of the challenges here is that you can't beat something with nothing. If the U.S. is going to tell countries that they shouldn't go down this path, I think it behooves us and the rest of the West and to have better coordination on aid and load and development packages, most particularly with Japan. But we need to be able to offer alternatives. They may not be as beneficial, inducing. We certainly are not going to do corruption and payoffs, but there at least should be a real alternative.
The China and Russia are offering the package deal as a sort of a one set to provide assistance for the new spacefaring nations or those who want to be a new spacefaring nation. But I think the China and Russia using these package deal as the national strategies of bringing these new potential spacefaring nations in their sphere of influence. And that's not really successful from my point of view, because on the one hand, it will have the strong constraints on what they want to do, because at the end of the day, the reason why they want to do space is because for their own benefit. For example, in the case in Philippines, of course, China has a lot of influence on Philippines, and they had this package deal to offer to build the small satellites for their own services. But Philippines chose to collaborate with the Japanese universities because it will provide more flexibilities, more down-on-earth cooperation, and there is a potential for the technological transfer. Developing nations wants to have not just the satellites, but they want to have the experience. They want to have the know-how. They want to build the experience. They want to build their technical capabilities. And this China-Russia package deal doesn't really provide that.
The risk coming from certain kind of partnerships that are offered by Russia and China. One, there is no market function when it comes to the Russian and Chinese partnership models. It's essentially the authoritarian regimes in both of these countries that are pursuing their national interest agenda, but it goes against the market function when they pursue these things in other countries. There are risks, of course, because one, I think they are forcing a lot of different countries in terms of aligning with them and taking on their, but I think the kind of reach, both diplomatic mileage that China and Russia get out of such partnerships, but also the kind of technological push that they might be doing without the market function is also a sort of a politically risky in a sense. So there are many security, political, as well as diplomatic risks that come from this.
Well, today we should be mindful of entities competing that are effectively state-owned or parastatal enterprises where they're not as sensitive to meeting marginal cost concerns. Although we in Europe may differ on market practices, we're both market economies. Japan is a market economy. Our other friends and allies are market economies. So non-market economies that can price under marginal cost should be in a different basket, first of all. And then when we look at them, we have to say, well, what are the inducements that are being offered and how might we counter them? I think one of the ways we do is we really revisit the World Trade Organization. We made a decision to admit China into the WTO, and they frankly haven't lived up to it. I don't think it's silly at all to think about diversifying away from China to have alternatives, whether it be Mexico or Vietnam or Indonesia or other places, diversifying supply chains to get more resiliency. Certainly the experience of COVID teaches us that we should do that.
Most effective way of providing or counter the China-Russia package deal is to provide a tailor-made support for the developing countries. They often have quite different views on space. They're not just only want to do space for the national pride or national prestige. They have more practical interest. They are more eager to learn return. And you have to provide incentives, and you have to provide the services to satisfy these demands. And I think this is possible for the more flexible approach, more open and free and more market-oriented approach, rather than the government strategy-oriented way to, let's say, here's the package deal, take it or leave it kind of approach.
And I think that's a very difficult thing. One of the ways that can be looked at in this context is, can the major Indo-Pacific powers and others come together in creating certain technology coalitions so that they can extend effective alternatives to Chinese and Russian models of cooperation, in a sense. So if there may be the Quad countries or a Quad plus other countries involving France or involving somebody else, can we form a technology coalition that would essentially manufacture small-scale satellites for these countries, for the emerging spacefaring powers? Or can we extend assistance in terms of training, share satellite data with these countries? So what kind of partnerships can we form in an effective manner so as to counter the Chinese and Russian space cooperation partnership models, in a sense, putting in additional financial resources and human resources in order to be able to effectively counter, because otherwise it's going to be on paper.
We don't really have full coherence on what to do about it. And in particular, what makes it difficult to agree on what to do about it is much of the infrastructure lies in the private sector's hands. In the US, we use secure systems on Amazon and Oracle and Microsoft. Will Europe rely on them or rely upon their own providers? The private sector has this increasingly large role. And so the standards for zero trust networks in the private sector are going to have a big impact on allied space security deliberations.
One way in which that China and Russia may pose economic and financial threat is the attack on the supply chain. From my point of view, space traditionally is a strategic domain, and there are much less dependence on the China and Russia. And technically speaking, Russian technologies are quite different from the Western technology, so there are not much compatibility. So I don't think there is any potential for the China and Russia posing the economic and financial threats, because we are not depending on them.
I think the economic and financial threats are understood and in some sense appreciated by the major spacefaring powers who are democracies. But again, like I said, most of the political leadership in these countries across the major Indo-Pacific powers or beyond, they look at the strategic implications as something more significant than the economic and financial aspects of the space security cooperation that is pursued by Russia and China.
I don't know deterrence is really the right model. I think we're really into compellence, which is the other side of deterrence. So deterrence is, please don't do this. And I will either deny your attack objectives or I'll retaliate in some way to deter you. The problem is what we really want is to compel people to follow common laws and trade. We want them to follow the terms of WTO. We want people to follow rules of anti-corruption procedures. We want the Chinese and Russians largely to follow norms that have been created for how market economies deal with each other. And so how do you get someone to obey the law? And maybe deterrence is possible here. Maybe I should revisit that. But that we can certainly retaliate for non-market control-oriented practices, things that are harmful. But it's not clear that the Chinese are really going to care on any retaliation we might do. We can try to deny them from succeeding, and that means providing alternatives to countries that are faced with it, provide ways for them to escape or get out of it if they've made bad judgments. But longer term, it's compellence. It's, follow the rules of the rest of the world and don't consider yourself special or exempt because you're Chinese or whatever it is, or because you're American. That is, certain universal norms that you ought to follow. And I think that's at the core, really the big problem with China is that it sees things as a hierarchy. There's a central kingdom, there's everybody else. So it's not, all countries are equal to each other. Well, the Chinese don't believe that. They believe there's a hierarchy. There's, a mandate of heaven, there's an emperor, and being harmonious is when everyone knows their proper place. It's when people get out of their proper place that there is disharmony. And, I think that is a fundamentally different way of looking at the world. But they have these ideas of sphere of influence, like the Russians, but in a way that's much more hierarchical than even the Russians. Everybody is in relationship to them, whereas Russia just wants to have its own sphere of influence, however brutally enforced, and in a multipolar world, and doesn't like to see dominance by the US or the West. But they don't have this idea that they're necessarily in a hierarchy and that the Slavs are the top of the hierarchy and everybody else has to put themselves in a relationship to that. The Chinese do. They ideologically, politically, and what they're doing now has a sense of exceptionalism, that the rules don't apply to them. And so they have to be compelled until they decide to reform their ways. And until they reform their ways, we have to act with extreme caution and understand what we're getting into, diversify away from them. It's like having a bad neighbor in the neighborhood. You just got to deal with it because they're not like you. They don't follow the same rules.
Is more important is what we can do for the allies in the developing countries. I mean, the new spacefaring nations tend to rely on China and Russia more. Japan, US, or Europe are pretty much independent from China and the Russian space capabilities, and therefore we are much more resilient to such threats. But I think the new spacefaring nations are more vulnerable. So I think what we can do is to provide alternative. Japan provided opportunities to collaborate with countries in Indo-Pacific through the APRSAF, the Asia-Pacific Space Agency Regional Forum. I think the APRSAF provide a very strong alternative to the APUSCO, and the APRSAF is a sort of a forum to discuss about this possibility of using space and developing space capabilities, how to build a small satellite or how to collaborate with the other research institutions.
We are still in the deliberation stage. We have not really moved beyond very initial stages of deliberation. I'm not even saying that we have had serious conversations on this, but I think we are getting somewhere very serious now. Of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, China's aggressive behavior in the Indo-Pacific throughout the last 2 years in the middle of the pandemic. And one of the things is possibly a return of the technology export control regimes that were very popular, that were quite effective during the Cold War years. So I would think that there will be a return to the possibilities of this technology spread to a very large number of countries who are not like-minded, like the Indo-Pacific major powers or Europe and so on and so forth. But I think there are going to be problems on that front. It's not going to be as easy as we have done in the past during the Cold War. Today, space technology has spread to a very large number of countries. So again, how do you stem the further proliferation? There are already certain steps taken by the US, for instance. The number of the kind of Chinese students who come into US universities, high-tech programs and kind of things, and the kind of benefit that they get. So high-end science and technology domains, I think the US has already started placing limitations in terms of the Chinese students who can access, who can be part of the universities in the United States. So I think such measures are going to be taken up by a number of advanced countries who have advanced space capabilities, and these kind of advanced space programs